let me just start perhaps with the first bit of our conversation that really wants to look much more closely at what innovation actually is. Now, obviously, since the late 20th century, in the EU and in national contexts, we've seen a really close interweaving, certainly in policy and in funding terms, of the terms research, science and innovation. In fact, I think you might be able to correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the European Union's 8th Framework Programme for Research, Horizon 2020, was actually the first to integrate research and innovation. But the term, of course, is so prevalent today that it can sometimes go unexamined. So let me begin by asking you to define what innovation means for you and what its core ingredients are.
Thank you so much. I love talking about innovation, and it's a passion of mine. Because I think that sometimes it's used in political terms, not in the right way. First and for all, I think that innovation is something very simple. For me, it's something that is new and useful. There's a lot of things that are new and not useful, and a lot of things that are useful but not new. And innovation is exactly that. So innovation is really the engine of growth, and that's why it's so important for our societies. But innovation is also like a jigsaw, it's a puzzle. You have so many ingredients that when one of the ingredients is not there, innovation doesn't happen. And that's the problem, because you have politicians that come and say, look, we're going to put billions in innovation, we're going to do this or that, and then people are disappointed because it doesn't work. And it doesn't work because you have to have all the ingredients. And there's so many examples. I remember in the beginning of the years 2000, Boston was not the place that is today in terms of biotechnology. But suddenly the piece of the puzzle, which was the venture capital that was missing, came to the city of Boston. And when the puzzle was complete on all the ingredients, the universities, the companies, the people, the financing, all together are there, it worked. And it became really one of the most amazing places for biotech. By the way, the founder of Moderna is a Frenchman, a colleague of mine at Harvard at the time, that really set up the company there because of that, because the ecosystem was complete. And so I think that one of the problems of Europe has been that we always have some missing part on the puzzle. And when you miss a part of the puzzle, it doesn't work. You can have the best science, the best companies, but if they're not there together in the same soup, it doesn't work. And so I think that's what innovation is about. And that's what we have as academics and politicians and the civil society do for it to work.
Thank you, Carlos. It's a wonderful way to starting us off. Let me prod a little bit further. I mean, you're speaking at the university tonight, and I really wanted to hear your view on the contribution, the very particular contribution that the public research and higher education base it makes to addressing innovation and also the innovation challenges.
I think that if there's a field where I think this partnership in between public and private is so important, is exactly in innovation. Exactly those parts of the puzzle, which is a very strong public commitment and at the same time a very strong private commitment, are essential, are exactly on innovation. And you see that when you compare the EU with the US. If you compare it in terms of public money, it's probably not that different, but the private money in the US is much bigger than the public money. But I think that the public side of it, and the public side goes from the very, very fundamental research, which is essential for everything that we're talking. Without that piece of the puzzle, it doesn't work. It needs really public money. And in Europe, what you have is basically one-to-one. You have for each euro of public money, you have €1 of private money. And in the US, you have for each euro of public money, you have around €2 of private money. And so that's the difference that really makes it better, or at least it was in the past. I am a big believer that Europe will turn around for new opportunities. I think that's the big difference. But the public side, it's so important. And when you look at Europe, you see the companies, the countries, sorry, where you have invested more in science, and especially on fundamental science, were the ones that weathered better the crisis, especially on the financial crisis. So you really have a correlation in between the ones that invest in science that really can go through crisis in a much better shape than the ones that don't.
So the way you portray it really, it sounds a little as if you think Europe has sort of lost its way a little. I mean, we know about the rather phenomenal historical importance of science in Europe and its contribution to the development of the same. But the way that you speak about it really seems to suggest that you prefer, or you at least you look with a keen eye towards a different kind of nations and how they are doing this. You cited the US, but there's obviously also China to consider. So where do you situate Europe at this point in time? And yeah, so let's start off with where you situate it right now, and then go to the future just after.
I think that first we should really, I think I don't like when in Europe I hear people just bad-mouthing Europe and talking how difficult it is in Europe. If you look at the first wave, what Steve Case actually calls it in his book, the first wave of innovation, it was Europe. I mean, Nokia, Siemens, the infrastructures of the internet, they were European. By the way, if you're doing a phone call, a cell call in the US, you have an antenna that is European. So the pipes of the internet were European. Tim Berners-Lee, I mean, I can go on and on. And so on that first wave, Europe was so strong. Remember GSM. Remember when you would go to the United States and you could not do a mobile phone call because there was no mobile phones in the US, and we had it already in Europe. And then it came a second wave, which I think the US really took over. The pure digital. The applications, the Facebooks, the Googles, and you name it. And Europe lost it. I mean, it was totally lost by Europe. Europe could not catch up with that wave. Why? Because that wave was about speed and scale. And Europe divided, fragmented, the countries, the different regulations could not give that speed and scale. And so that was the second wave. But then when people ask me, but so when are you going to produce in Europe the next Google? I say, look, but the next phase of innovation will not be about Google or Facebook. It will be something very different. Because when I was young, like in 1998, I was basically in my second year at Harvard Business School, I got an offer to work for Google. And I thought, I mean, I don't want to work for like a company that looks at web pages. Doesn't make any sense. So I had no vision. I didn't know that that was the wave. And now there's a lot of people trying to work on these companies that are now big, thinking they will be the next ones. They are not. And so the big thing is like, what will be this third wave? And what is the third wave? And the third wave is just starting. And I think that's where Europe should focus, is on thinking about that third wave. And for me, that third wave is good news for Europe, because it will definitely be somewhere in the fundamental science link with society and solving problems of the people. And you see that with artificial intelligence, or you see that with quantum mechanics. You see that really on machine learning. You see that the next wave will be about that. And we are very good at that. We are very good at really the fundamental science in Europe. We have 2 million scientists. And if you look at the top 10 publications, citations of the top 10 publications, I mean, Europe is there with the US, neck to neck. There's not a big difference. And so I think that Uta, we have to look at that third wave and invest on that third wave. And that for me is really to invest in this link, in between fundamental science and people. And that comes to my points of asking scientists to tell the story, to have a narrative, to connect with people, to talk in a language that people understand, because that for me is essential for that next wave. People will be really proud if we can do it. And the best example is the vaccines. I mean, does anybody really know what mRNA is apart of the scientists? Nobody, but everybody knows that this is amazing code that you can send with a vaccine, and then you have these antibodies and you are excited about it. And so the pandemics is what an amazing example of what fundamental science can do.
It's a really interesting point, because I was going to ask you about the challenges to the model. I want to come back to your third wave and some of the questions that the technological innovation also raises in terms of privacy, in terms of governance, etc. But before I do so, I'm quite keen to follow up on what you've just said, which is the impact of COVID, obviously, on innovation and what we've learned from it, where we think, as you've just outlined, we've seen extraordinary progress. We've seen extraordinarily quick turnaround, something that was not considered possible before in terms of the development of vaccines. But we've also, of course, seen the difficulties of doing that in a world where several companies will try and do so at the same time. You have issues of distribution, you have issues of procurement, and you have obviously the usual questions that come in when it comes to this being a public good and how such a public good should best be distributed, particularly in the early phase. You know, you see where I'm going with this. So I wanted to ask you about parts of sort of the COVID consequences on innovation that sort of also show us where we need to do better. And I also wanted to ask you, in that context, let's take it through COVID, if you like, by looking at really science powerhouses like China, and see how Europe should position itself in this environment. You've cited very positively the example of the US. Where is China coming in that? And maybe we can focus this through the COVID lens.
Yeah, so no, absolutely. Uta, I think so. On the COVID lens, just to tell a story, which was in 2014. This very young man called Ingmar Herr is the founder of CureVac, came to us in the commission asking for money to develop these new types of vaccines through mRNA. And we really gave this man money at the time because we believed in his intuition. And Ingmar, which is also a great person to invite one day to UCL to speak, he basically told us further on that the reason that he was able to get where he got with CureVac and the new vaccine was because Europe believed in him. And so there's this really unique thing about Europe, that we were the ones that really are able to believe in the intuition of science. And we did that also with Ugur Sahin, the founder of BioNTech, who is an ERC grantee. And if you talk to him, you'll see that he tells like one of the reasons that they are where they are has been the ERC grants. And so that is a major difference today from Europe and other parts of the world. And that can make us a magnet of science, of attracting people from other parts of the world. A little bit what basically the US did after the Second World War with the Institute of Advanced Studies at Princeton, where people like Einstein and Lorentz and those went to the US, and the pendulum of story made that all those amazing minds went to the US. I think that Europe today has that potential, and the COVID story is really one that I think one should be proud. Then I thought that you were asking also about the fact of the vaccines as a public good, and there I saw something very unique in this crisis, which was that you know, we are so worried with multilateralism and the fact that multilateralism is not working anymore as it used to. And I always tell, when I visited as a commissioner UNESCO in Paris, an amazing, beautiful building. And it was a day that was raining. And at some point there was a bucket because there was raining coming inside the building because they had no money for maintenance of the building. And that is very sad. But that shows that multilateralism has to change. And COVID also, the lenses of COVID, you saw a change in multilateralism. You saw that that change actually came from the UK with Jeremy Farrar, that was able very early on to become a very strong voice saying, look, we just have one exit, that exit is science. And then Ursula von der Leyen, from one day to another, was able to get together the governments, the foundations, the NGOs, the stakeholders to get around 15 billion euros for the vaccine very early on. And so what you saw is that multilateralism was working because it was not anymore just about governments. And you have seen other examples of that, but I think that it's also a very interesting point that we've seen in the crisis. And third, I think that what we saw, and that's the great news for innovation, is that I think we saw a very, an acceleration of innovation during these times. I was talking with Henry Chesbrough, one of my mentors at Haas Business School the other day, and he was showing me the numbers of the increase in innovation in companies during this period, because you know, people could not afford the typical analysis paralysis of companies. One had to decide very quickly. Ideas would come to the boss and you have to go and do it. And so you have, I mean, I think we have all seen in the different countries an acceleration of the number of patents, innovation, and ideas. And that's very positive, and I'm being positive here on these terrible times we're having, and so I'm not putting the accent on the difficulties and the tragedy, but I think there's some points, especially on our area of innovation, that have been positive, and I think we should look at that as an opportunity for the future.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Obviously, we've seen very interesting relationships also around the idea of how you regulate innovation, which with the vaccines, again, has shown that countries take different approaches. We know that, for instance, the European Union and member states were slightly later with approving AstraZeneca, for instance, but so was the FDA. Which is much less talked about. And so we also see obviously a question of how quickly, if you innovate quickly, how quickly do you then adapt your processes of regulation and post hoc, if you like, responsibility. This maybe takes me to sort of our third part of our conversation, which is, if you like, the future of innovation and how we might be able to conceptualize its challenges, and where Europe might then come in very forcefully and very positively. So when you outlined the three waves of innovation, and you outlined the one that you saw coming as the next one, which is really what you once described as deep tech, right? The deep integration between the physical and the digital worlds. Now, these will themselves raise quite an important amount of questions. But how do you think? Explain it to us. How do you think this is likely to turn out? It is something that we still see as quite a scenario that's still quite some time away, but that will likely come to determine our lives very, very strongly. How do you see that wave, that third wave, materializing, particularly perhaps in Europe?
I think there's, you see that that wave already materializing in terms of the transformation of some of the fundamental science that was created 100 years or 50 years ago today into something practical. So you've seen not long ago in Delft in the Netherlands, the first time that we were able to prove that Einstein was right, and proving that you can have two particles that actually are not connected, and they react exactly in the same way. So Einstein had this idea that he actually called it a spooky action at distance, that one particle could turn 0 and 1 without any connection. And so you already have seen that this is a major advance for cybersecurity, because if you have no connection in between the particles and they move into 0 and 1s at the same time, by the theory of Einstein, on cybersecurity, you can have an amazing change, because the problem of security is that you could get into the pipelines or the backdoors into these two points. And so you are seeing already that transformation, and that transformation, I think it's happening in Europe, in a lot of places. Of course, today, I mean, it's when I say Europe, I would always remember that when we had the first picture of a black hole, and we had all those scientists together, there was, for the paper of the gravitational waves, there was more than 1,000 scientists from all over the world. So I think that science is really about collaboration, and collaboration is from all over the world, but Europe is really there. So I see that transformation, but that transformation has a couple of implications. One is that you have tensions in society. Some are good, some are not as good. One is this merger in between the physical and the digital worlds that is happening and accelerated a lot during the crisis. And that is something that is good, because a lot of the sectors were resisting to that change. Education, I mean, people 5 years ago, 3 years ago, you would not have these kind of conversations with a Zoom or a class, and now you have it. Doctors that always said that consultations over video were not good enough. And so that is changing, and I think is a good change. But it's also doing something that is, we are giving much more value to the physical presence. We are, it's not anymore banal to show up. And I think that contrary to what people think, physical presence will be something that will be much more valued. And that before the crisis, we would just run around and show up all the time. And today, we will go if it's really needed. And so I think that that acceleration is happening. Then you have an acceleration or a tension in between the national and supranational levels. And that is a tension that will have an implication also on the fundamental science, because you have this tension in between the nations and the supranational organizations like the European Commission or the multilateral organizations, because countries still think that they can solve problems that today are global, and countries cannot do that. So I foresee a lot of protectionism coming, because people are getting to a position of protecting themselves, not knowing that in economic terms is always a very bad idea, is shooting yourself on the foot, but protectionism is there. I mean, I was reading about, since the financial crisis in the G20, there were more than 6,000 measures of protectionism by countries since then. So it's not even COVID, it comes from before. And I think that that will have an impact in our lives. And we have to, for once and for all, try to reinvent that multilateralism that we were talking about, and that the European Commission and the European Union is, I would say, the most beautiful form of multilateralism, because it's not multilateral, is really looking at the good of all together of the Union. And third is this tension in between really freedom and control. And that is very scary, because I am a techno-optimist. I love technology. And when I look at the effect of technology in our democracy and in our lives, it's really getting to a point that you need to seriously regulate. And Europe has been, for the first time in a long time, at the forefront of that regulation with the GDPR, now with the Digital Services Act or the Digital Markets Act. So you see that Europe has gained a lot of influence, because most of the big companies worldwide are following our rules. And it's interesting because the US somehow went into a deregulation path in the last 20 years. And that was not only bad for the US itself, but it was actually for the EU quite good, because we become the regulator. And so I think that that tension in between control and freedom will have to be very well crafted through good regulation, and that is something that that is very difficult to do. But I think that Europe is quite ahead of others.
Thank you, Carlos. There's quite a lot to unpack here. I think that's the most fascinating part, really, of sort of the issues that you've raised, is how we deal with those future challenges. Now, I think the governance of emerging science and innovation is generally something that is a really key challenge to contemporary democracies, both in terms of privacy and individual rights and the collective rights and the ever increasing merging of the two realms, but also generally about the role of science itself. So obviously we have got a long backstory here from Francis Bacon to Michael Polanyi. Basically, the question is, to what extent does science implicate itself in society, serves society, or to what extent do we understand it as that sort of free republic of science that shouldn't be accountable to political powers, or indeed in any shape or form constrained by it. Now, the sort of ramifications that we get today of the big questions that really take science into a completely new dimension for many of us. The question really does arise where that sort of responsibility actually lies. Who can say which areas of science and innovation we want to support? Where do we need to be very careful about its regulation? And is regulation still, when does regulation happen? So often, at the very beginning of an innovative process, we might not actually know where that innovative process will lead us. So when does regulation happen? I would really like to pick your brains a little bit on that particular conundrum between science and society, between the freedom to develop and innovate, and the regulation that's the counterpart of support.
There's a lot of questions in that question, and I think that let's start by the fact that when I think you said the freedom of science, the freedom of doing science. And I think that that freedom is essential. And that's why I think the European model for financing science and fundamental science was so successful, because it was not dependent on politics or politicians. There was a real freedom of scientists to bring ideas bottom up. And I think that that's so important. But at the same time, you as a country, you have to give direction. And that's where we did so much work with Mariana Mazzucato from the UCL on defining in Europe what were the missions of Europe. What did we want to do? What were the direction that we want to give? Because if you don't give direction, then people don't know where you're going. And then even if you give direction, it doesn't mean that everybody has to follow that direction. But I think that that direction is part of the link in between science and society. Scientists have to have that link. And I always would remember one of my couple of visits to the CERN in Switzerland, where one of the scientists there told me something that I would never forget. He told me, look, I'm a lady. I said, tell me the story of CERN and what do you do? And he said, look, I'm going to tell you the story that I know you like, but and tell you that the reason that I'm here is something that you understand, but the real reason is not that. I mean, the real reason you'll never understand it, because it's not logical, and it's something totally different. And so that language is super important today, especially in the times that a lot of governments are not investing as much as they should. And you saw that even with the crisis, even with the pandemics. I mean, the increase is very small in terms of science and innovation, in terms of investing in science. And so I think that the link in between the scientists and politicians and politics is there. And if scientists decide that they do not want to get involved, then we will have a problem. And that's why I was such a fan of Michael Arthur, because he was able to basically go and tell what he thought at the time in the British Parliament, because you have sometimes to do that. You have to engage yourself. And so you have to also become a politician or a part of you. You have to engage with the conversation. You cannot just say, look, I want to be free, but I don't want to have any contact with the political power. So I think that that is essential. But the notion of the freedom of science, I think that's one of the major principles of the European Union, and it's on the treaties of the European Union, and I think we should really cherish that in terms of the articles on research and innovation at the level of the Union. So we have to see it that way, but governments have really to give direction. I mean, there's no other way, so people can understand.
Thank you. Yes, I think it's precisely that sort of very curious relationship, isn't it, between how scientists can both inform policy processes and decision making, and at the same time being impacted, obviously, by them. And that sort of give and take is something that really has come towards to universities much more strongly in the last decade or two than previously. We begin to have questions in the chat, so I wondered whether we would segue quite naturally into developing the conversation by picking up some of the questions that are being put in the Q&A and in the chat. For our participants, perhaps I would suggest that you put them in the Q&A so that I only have one place to look, but I'm looking at both of them. Picking up now one question by Craig Nicholson, who has really looked at the question of future emerging technology flagships, which the EU has previously given significant amounts of funding to, which sit at the intersection of science and innovation, be that on the human brain or in quantum technologies. So his question really seems to be about the question of a top-down development of policy, into which sort of is one way of looking at that conversation between scientists and policymakers, and that sort of giving direction that you've previously seen. And the European Innovation Council, of course, which developed under your stewardship, which seems to take a rather much more bottom-up approach. So what do you think is really needed to make investment in innovation and this sort of the picking of right projects a success?
Yeah, I think that Greg's question, and hi, Greg, very nice to know that you are on the call, talks about exactly the way we were doing it and then the change that we thought and designed. Those flagships which Greg is referring to, the human brain and the quantum technology, were very much top-down somehow, and they were not interdisciplinary enough. So I remember that we had a lot of problems, especially on the human brain one, because at some point we had discussions in between the IT people and more the neurosciences people. And so the idea, actually the seed of the idea of getting these two instruments called the missions that Mariana Mazzucato developed for us, and then the EIC, the European Innovation Council, was to mix the bottom up and the top down. The missions would give direction, and then the ideas would come bottom up through open calls at the European Innovation Council, where people could come with ideas in the intersection really of every science. And so that was the real change. And I think the experience of these flagships, in my view, was the starting point of seeing that it was not working the way we were doing before. And so I really hope that now with the 5 missions that Mariana developed for the European Union, that we can have it in a different way, where you have these 2 bottom-up, top-down approaches. And the experiences that I've been told since I've left is very good, because we are really getting amazing projects that come from fields and intersection of fields that never before happened in the European Union. And I'm very proud of that, and proud to know that the European Innovation Council became an institution with an agency at the European level. My dream is that the UK that will participate will also be part of this development. I think that there's great news about the fact that the UK will participate, and that's thanks to the involvement of a lot of you in the academic world in the UK. That's a big victory for science and for the UK and for the relationship. And I think that we'll take it from there in the future.
Thank you. I have a second question in the chat, in the Q&A, which I was wondering, because it sort of seems to segue very nicely from Craig Nicholson's question just now, by Kevin Bocage, who really goes back to your question of the wave of innovation being a sort of a continuous cycle. And you refer to Facebook and Google, for instance, now being dominant in the market, but you also refer to other processes that are likely to become the places where cutting edge research will develop in the future. So once again, I think the question is where does innovation happen? And then that way it's segued from the previous question, where does innovation happen, and how can policymakers pick up what is happening at the very, very early stage, but also how can those scientists and young people, as the question put it, place their focus for innovation and research, sort of understanding how the field develops and where they might come in themselves?
I think that really innovation, or at least the type of innovation that we want, innovation that creates jobs, which is very different from just have innovation like having something that you do more efficiently. That's also innovation, but it's not the same kind. This kind of innovation that the European Innovation Council is talking about, and that we were talking about, is innovation that comes from the intersections of different fields. And the only way to do that is to give freedom to the innovator, is to focus more in the innovator than the innovation. When we did the EIC, it was very interesting, because we had, before you'd receive the applications and the European Union would give money to the top applications. And then I said, look, we have to change that. I want you to interview those that you want to give money and then do a selection. And what happened when you started the interview process is that you would feel that some of the ones that were on the top, they were not the best ones, because the energy, the innovator, the person was not as good. And I think that that focus on the innovator, on the person, on the energy of that person, it's what makes the difference, because you can have a fantastic idea, but sometimes you don't have what it takes to get that idea to another level. And sometimes you have an average idea, but you have what you, in your guts, something that when you do a lot of these interviews, you feel that that person, even with an average idea, can get to a different level of innovation. And so this kind of innovation comes really from the freedom of the scientist or the innovator. I remember visiting the Weizmann Institute in Israel and seeing the beauty of what they do in terms of their PhD students, where when you get into the Weizmann Institute in Israel, you have to spend 6 months in a different lab or a different discipline than the one that you will write your thesis or your PhD. And I stuck to my mind that I met a guy that basically, because he was really a doctor doing a PhD in oncology, and he spent 6 months in a lab that was treating plants, and was a biologist, and he basically found a treatment for prostate cancer through the principle of photosynthesis. And I think those are the stories that really make the difference, and so that's the way that this kind of innovation happens. But is very hard. It's very hard because when you want to work in the intersection of disciplines, my experience is that you have to have a huge self-confidence. You have to know that you will be frustrated a lot of days, that teams will not work as well as a team of people from all the same kind of university in the same sectors and the same disciplines. So it takes a lot of time, and a lot of politicians or countries, they decide not to do it because there's a lot of failure. There's a lot of failure, and we have to acknowledge that.
Thank you, Carlos. Wonderful. I think we're getting ever closer into the sort of the question of where the bubbling up happens, where the sort of research segues into innovation. And perhaps I might take you back to that question that we started off with as well, which is on the relationship between universities and innovation policy more broadly speaking. Obviously, there will be plenty of areas of research that they won't be able to translate research into innovation, which is perfectly fine. Would you, however, feel that the very fact that innovation has become such a big part of research and higher education policy as well, if you would therefore feel that it is likely to be in some sense influential on that kind of blue skies research that may not lead to any sort of translatable output, precisely because also obviously we are finding ourselves in an environment in which public funding for research is ever more constrained, and where the role of private money, as you outlined so persuasively at the beginning, begins to play a bigger role. I'm playing devil's advocate here. I just wanted to ask you a little bit further on that relationship.
No, I think that both things are true. You need to invest more in fundamental science, and at the same time, you need more private money because private money is important at a later stage. But I think that and I want you to go directly where you're coming, which is that you said something that I found very interesting, but for instance, the example of social sciences, is it something that will get us to innovation? And I will say yes, because if you see in fields like energy today, when you are innovating in the field of grids and infrastructures of electricity, the innovations that I saw during the last 5 years, they were about behavior, about studying sociologically how people consume energy. And so you have a huge role for the social sciences in some of these areas of innovation. The problem is that the people that are in charge of that innovation, engineers mostly in these kind of sectors, they never saw any value. I mean, they never saw social sciences as important. And today, things have changed. The same way that I was saying that digital was so important in the second wave, and now you have to go to the deep tech. I think that now also, if you want to innovate really in science, in different types of science, social sciences are becoming extremely important. And exactly because what I mean, you said, and you talked also, you talked before about the fact that if you are in such a digital world, the importance of social sciences will become really much more than before, because everything will be digits and zero and ones, but human beings and the experience of that is not zero and ones. There's something there that's much more. And so probably at some point, all these sectors, I'm going to just do an exaggeration of my point. that you can do with machines, all the calculations, you can develop all the skills of an engineer and you can do it. But then there's something that you will not able to replicate, which is the relationships in between human beings, the anthropology, sociology, our behavior, and that will be probably the most important part of the job. And so you will have the social sciences doing their normal work, and we have to invest more on that. And then we have to also to invest on the links of those social sciences with everything that is happening today in technology. And I tell you, I think the major decisions of the future in terms of technology, they are not about technology, they are about politics, and they are about social sciences integrating that world. And the crisis that we live today and the fear that we have is because these worlds are not talking, people are not talking, and so we're lost in the middle. What you see when they interview people like Zuckerberg or these major guys from Uber or whatever, I mean, they don't know what to do, because, you know, when you see something like Twitter saying and canceling the tweet account of Donald Trump, which, let me be clear, I think that it was really what we had. I mean, that's what we wanted, because it's so outrageous, the horrible things that that president had to say. That, but giving that power to a company, giving that power to Twitter, I mean, that's, so that shows how difficult it is, because we are not talking, and these people, they are doing things that should be up to governments and supranational authorities. And so this is something that I wanted to give you as for the ones that are in the social sciences, that I think that probably in 10 years, some of you that today your parents, and I know a lot of countries that parents say, oh, don't go to social science, go something else to find a job. I think that you will have probably more jobs than you think, than people that went to other types of sciences. This is, I mean, I'm speculating and exaggerating, but I think that it's the trend is there.
In fact, I may probably extend that and include philosophers as well, because one of the biggest questions is likely to come also in the area of ethics and the understanding of what is still ethical, and where the boundaries between, particularly between what's private and what's collective, where and to what extent we know about each other's lives and government knows about each other's lives, how to regulate that. This kind of brings me back to the question of regulation, actually, and I want to ask you again about regulation. Your Twitter example is a perfect example. We have this platform which really revolutionized the way people talk to each other, commented on each other, spread knowledge, made political participation possible, but we also all know the downsides of it. Now, we're finding ourselves in a point in which it's a very entrenched mechanism, in a place therefore where everybody keeps using it, and where regulation is very, very hard to do. So we're finding ourselves in a point where regulation of this extraordinary innovation in our lives, communicative innovation, would, if anything, come not ex ante, if you like, but at a later stage. So what can and should governments, be they national or supranational, come? Where can they actually set in and look back on the effects of an innovation that wasn't necessarily clear at the outset, and try and intervene, if you like, to steer that and keep it in the bounds that is that doesn't take us down a route where a single company can have such extraordinary power?
I think that the major problem today is that the regulators and the legislators, they still legislate like in the past. And so one of the problems that we tried during my tenure to solve, and it was very difficult, was to change the way that we look at regulation, because a lot of the problems that we have, they are because you did regulate some products, and then those products are not anymore there. And then there's other products that you didn't regulate and they are there. And so having a flexible, looking forward regulation that should not be as, I would say, a snapshot, but is, you know, in finances, we talk a lot about snapshots, the balance sheet, and then you have the cash flow, which is the flow. I think that regulation today is like a snapshot. You take a picture, you regulate on that point of time, but then things change immediately. And so 1 year later, that piece of regulation doesn't make sense. And so you have to regulate in a very different way, having sunset clauses in your regulation, because some of the things that you regulate will not make any sense, and they still are hanging, they have to disappear. Then you have to create experimental clauses where people can experiment different things. And you have to put ways that a regulation is not about regulating products, but regulating principles. So first of my points to clear related to your question, but not the only point I wanted to make. The second point is about the fact that we have a major problem on these platforms, which is that we were never able to regulate, to get them to open what we call, and now I'm going to be a little bit nerd and geek, the APIs. So there's a layer of coding called the APIs, which is the protocols that make that if you create Facebook or if you create Uber, nobody else can create something similar. And so you become a monopoly, you become monopolistic, and you basically have what you have today. And so one of the mistakes of the past is that you should have opened those APIs that should be in open data that someone else could create also on top of that, their services. And that would basically have diluted the power of these giants. And that's something that now we are starting to talk. We started that back in 2017, but it was very difficult to explain politically. And that's one of the things that one should do in the future. And third, I think that also one of these characteristics of the third wave is that it's fundamental science, it's deep tech, but is also related to fields that touch people, that are part of our lives, like health or education. And so regulation becomes really important, and politicians will not be able to do that alone. So in the same way that I've talked about changes in multilateralism, I think those changes will apply also to regulation that will have to be done through a co-design of politicians with people that are stakeholders, with communities, and that will be the way that we can regulate in future-proof, if one could say that. And we don't know yet how to do that.
Thank you. I'm taking that cue from you about politicians because we have another question, a very good question from Craig Nicholson. Now, let me try and be as good as I can on an innovative program such as Zoom, and ask whether Craig, who should now have permission, will want to ask his question live. If you do, please try, and otherwise I will read it out for you.
Uta, it will take one more second to give Craig permission. Okay. Hi, Craig. Now you should be able to unmute yourselves, hopefully.
I can, yes. Thank you very
Wonderful.
much. And hi, Carlos. My question is about the brief mention at the beginning that you might be interested in running for, I think it was Mayor of Lisbon. So I don't know whether you would confirm or deny that, but either way, what do you think is the role for local politicians in all the things we've been talking around? And if you are happy to confirm, is your expertise in R&D part of the reason why you're interested in the role?
And Greg, you put me in a very difficult situation because I will first time I'll talk to the people of Lisbon tomorrow at 6 p.m. Lisbon time on the reasons of why I'm a candidate. And so I've been now chosen by my party and I'm discussing with other parties, but especially with civil society, to have a strong coalition. And I'm bound not to talk really about that until tomorrow at 6 p.m. But I tell you something, I think that the power of cities and the importance of cities will become bigger and bigger. And eventually, as some will say, the post-Westphalian way of the world with the nation states will change to a more city-states kind of world where cities become extremely important. So I think that cities are really in the future, really the center of the major decisions. They will link with the supranational organizations more directly than countries. You saw that with the Paris Agreement, where cities like New York or San Francisco and others were taking a role that the national government was not taking. And so that is a very good example. But I will stay here. And Greg, I would ask you just to keep these until tomorrow at 6 p.m. As if you can.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Yes, we don't intend to intervene there at all. I think it is an interesting construct. Of course, we look at the European Union as a form, a particularly sophisticated form of multi-level governance, and we have seen particular policy initiatives by individual cities. You mentioned Paris. You might just as well mention Barcelona, who are really sort of staking their foot in their plans on an idea of becoming innovation hubs, places where both industry and R&D and research universities and international institutions come together to foment an ideal environment for innovation to happen. So even beyond your comments, which have been cautious for obvious reasons, I think there's a clear sense that within the European Union in particular, that sort of relationship between the different levels might be happening. We have, however, also another question which takes us beyond Europe, but which goes back to the question of universities. And I wanted to ask whether Ritika would like to ask the questions again live. I think it should be possible. So I hand over to Ritika.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi, thank you so much. So, Carlos, my question is more in the context of India, developing country like India, where, you know, there is not a lot of funding in terms of research and development in the universities. So in those cases, when the government is trying to collaborate at one point with the industry and the startups for policy making directed at innovation, do you think it's more preferable to collaborate with industries rather than universities in such scenarios? Thank you.
So your question, if I really understood the full of the question, because you were telling about the context, I think, of developing countries and the funding of research that in those countries is unfortunately at very low levels. And if one would prefer or not to then engage more in with the industry. First, I think it's the role of places like the European Union, and the European Union has been paramount on that, to engage with countries outside of Europe and make the difference in terms of collaboration, in terms of funding. And I think that we have a role that is extremely important. And the European Commission, if I remember, we had more than 15 or 16 associations with countries that would go from, of course, Switzerland and Israel, which is a different case, very developed for that sense, but then going to Azerbaijan or to Armenia, and of course, associations also that we have with countries like India. And so I think that really bringing the scientists and bringing the science of those countries and helping them to fund that kind of research is essential. the relationship with industry is always very important. But I think that in my view, you have to put first the money, the public money, then the private money. Because what happens in countries that you have very low levels of investment of public money, you have the industry engaging, but the industry will not fund fundamental science. The industry will not fund any kind of science that is not related very quickly to what they're doing. And so you do innovate, but I think that in a very particular way, which is basically innovating directly for that kind of company or that kind of sector. And I think that it's something that Europe has a huge responsibility and to help and to create collaborations that are peer-to-peer, not Europe telling others what to do, but collaboration where you work together and collaborate together. So I think that's absolutely crucial. You cannot just engage with the private sector. I mean, it doesn't work.
Could I ask you a follow-on question from that? That works quite well. We talked previously about the way that Europe has chosen its very particular approach to supporting science and to supporting innovation. Obviously, the elephant in the room, if you like, is China. How China is an extraordinarily important player in this field. They will become ever more so. How do you see China do innovation if they do it differently? And how is Europe likely, or perhaps how should Europe respond to that?
I think that China, I would define the US on the digital side, Europe as science-based innovation, and China, what I call efficiency-driven innovation, because it's one of these places that you can test immediately whatever you do with millions of people. So you have a very quick way of testing your products. And so you kind of have these different models of innovation. And I think that China still has a long way in different fields, and especially in fundamental science. There's still a long way from China to the point that the EU or the US are. But of course, this is like a marathon. China is running very fast, but comes from a very low bar, and they run into it. They have 2% now of their GDP invested in science. There's around 200 billion euros a year. Europe has 2% of the GDP also, that's 280 billion. And the US 2.8% of GDP, which equates to around 480 billion. So there's still a difference, but China will get there. But I think that China still in the universities, they're not at the same level, but they are getting better. And I think that one should collaborate. I always have been for openness, and I'm somehow worried that because of the commercial and trade wars in between the US and China, that one could think that we should reduce collaboration with China. And I think that we should collaborate with China with proper rules and the reciprocity and understanding, but one should keep collaborating with China. And in my experience for big fundamental research, you need people from all over the world to get the big things. So China is a very important player, a competitor and an ally.
Thank you. I think that was spoken as the true politician and diplomat as well. We are getting quite close to the end of our allotted time, and I wonder if I could be slightly challenging, if you like. You may not want to answer this as you've very skillfully navigated Craig's question earlier, but obviously you're no longer European Commissioner for Research and Innovation. But at this particularly crucial time, what would you like to see the European Commission in this space develop? What should be its priorities and next steps?
In general, for these times that we're living, I think that the way that we've designed these 5 missions for Europe is extremely important for Europe. From a mission on cancer, which I think that Europe could really make a big difference by being the first place in the world where one can have the dream that in 10 years' time, nobody would die from cancer. I think that is something that people would understand and be proud of. To having, as we designed at the time, 100 cities totally neutral of carbon in Europe. Those missions, from the mission that we created in the oceans, those are missions that are very important, not just for science, but also for the identity of Europe and for creating this sense of identity. And that sense of identity of Europeans is a bit lost. And I would remember here one of probably one of the most amazing philosophers that passed away not long ago, Rabbi Lord Sachs, that used to say that if you reinforce your identity, you don't have fear of others, you respect others because you have your own identity. And I think that our identity as Europeans is really science. It's culture. That's what unites us, and reinforcing that is the only way out that we have against populism, extremism, and the times that we're living. You know, look at classical music. I mean, I think that such an amazing example. Classical music is European, is part of what we are, and that classical music should be one of our major points of identity. It's actually very interesting when you listen to the anthem of Europe, the Ninth Symphony of Beethoven, when the whole music starts. Listen, the other time that you listen to the anthem, look at there's a point where you find that the instruments are not talking to each other. There's some confusion, a cacophony, and then everything gets together and the music comes. And I think that Europe is really that. Is you kind of, when you get in, you find like, oh, everybody's talking and nobody's speaking the same language, and this is strange. But now when you get it together and you reinforce your identity, you really go to a different level. And I'm a big believer on that creation of reinforcing European identity. I am Portuguese, but I am also European. And I think that you can have these double identities. And probably Uta, you are a lot of things too, as a person living in the UK, and that doesn't cancel out anything. But if you have a strong identity, I think that one will be stronger.
It's a truly enlightenment vision with science at the heart, and in Kantian fashion, going beyond national borders. It's always, I've become enough of a Brit, I suppose, to always see that this is a discourse that will not always be easy on the home front, perhaps. But I think you may be right, and I want to place my hope in that science is actually that sort of joint endeavour where the EU and the UK have been extraordinarily aligned. And I do want to take it as a positive sign that the government has decided to keep us in Horizon Europe, to keep us therefore also with access to the EIC, and to continue work in that area as the neighbours engaged in the sort of common venture as it should be. So let's hope that is a very positive sign.